he bought a rusted trunk for 25 cents. That was all the money Wallace Boone had left in his pocket. The metal was shot, the lock busted clean off, and the wood was warped and swollen from a lifetime of neglect. Anyone else would have kicked it into the ditch. But when Wallace pried that lid open later that night, a tremor started in his hands and wouldn't stop. Inside, beneath a rotting dress, were papers, yellowed documents brittle with age. He saw names he knew, names that had no business being written on the same page. Letters in a handwriting that made his chest seize with a memory he couldn't place. And then he saw it. A deed. It was a deed to a massive stretch of land, prime territory with water rights. And it bore two names. The first was his late wife's family name. The second belonged to Edmund Hargrove, the wealthiest, most feared man in the territory. Wallace's breath hitched. This was impossible. His wife's family were laborers, drifters who worked other men's soil their whole lives. They never owned so much as a shovel, let alone 3,000 acres of the best land around. Then his eyes fell on the date. He read it once, then again. 7 times his finger traced the ink. The document was dated and signed just 3 days before his wife was even born. This deed shouldn't exist. This was a ghost from a past that never was. Everything she had ever told him, everything he had built his life on, was a lie. Or this paper was. He didn't know which was worse. He thought back to the old woman who sold him the trunk. Her eyes when he'd dropped those coins into her palm. It wasn't pity he'd seen. It wasn't curiosity. It was certainty. She knew. She knew exactly what was inside that trunk. It was like she hadn't been selling it. It was like she had been delivering it. He glanced over at his daughter, Clementine, asleep in her small room. She had no idea that her father was holding a piece of paper that could either save their world or burn it to the ground. A cold dread, sharp and sudden, washed over Wallace. Someone had gone to a lot of trouble to make sure this trunk, and the story it told, stayed buried forever. But he had found it, and as sure as the sun would rise, someone out there knew he had it. The sun had barely crested the ridge when the reality of his situation hit Wallace like a physical blow. He had 3 days. 3 days until the bank took his ranch, his home, every last splinter of the life he'd built with his wife. He sat at the kitchen table, the foreclosure notice staring up at him like a death warrant. The numbers swam before his eyes, a testament to 2 years of drought, bad luck, and spiraling debt. He emptied his leather pouch onto the table. A few sad coins rolled out. 25 cents. That was it. The sum total of a lifetime of breaking his back on land that was about to be ripped away from him. Clementine appeared in the doorway. At 16, she already had the weary posture of someone twice her age. Her shoulders were straight, but he could see the weight she carried on them. She looked at the papers, then at the coins, and her face remained a mask of stoicism. She knew. They didn't need to speak the words. She poured him a cup of water, her fingers brushing his shoulder for just a second. A small, silent gesture of solidarity that almost broke him. Wallace shoved himself away from the table, needing to move, to do anything other than sit there and drown in his failure. He stared out the window at the 20 acres of sun-scorched earth he'd poured his soul into. He and his wife had bought this place with so much hope. Now, it was just sand slipping through his fingers. He could sell the last of the cattle, but the prices were so low it would barely buy him another month. He could take work in town, but that meant leaving Clementine alone. He'd promised her mother he'd never do that. He decided to ride into town, not out of hope, but out of desperation. Anything was better than sitting still. He saddled his horse, and Clementine handed him a small bundle of bread and jerky. Her eyes were full of questions she was kind enough not to ask. He was grateful for that small mercy. The town was suffocating in the midday heat, dust hanging in the air like a shroud. He tied his horse outside the general store and just started walking. He passed the bank without looking at it, the saloon with its distant laughter sounding like it was from another world. Then he saw her. An old woman sat under a wooden awning, surrounded by a strange collection of junk. Broken chairs, rusted tools, cracked plates, and a trunk. A trunk that looked like it had been dredged from the bottom of a river. She watched him with pale, unblinking eyes. Her clothes were a patchwork of repairs, but they were clean. Her hands were folded in her lap, like she was waiting for a specific appointment. Wallace stopped in front of the trunk. He ran a hand over the corroded metal, the splintered wood. It was worthless, utterly worthless. He should have kept walking, but the way she watched him, that intense, knowing gaze, made him ask the price. She didn't speak. She just held up 2 fingers, then a thumb. 25 cents. The exact amount he had left in the world. It couldn't be a coincidence. He reached into his pouch, the coins feeling heavy and final in his palm. He thought of Clementine, of the foreclosure notice, of his promise to his wife. He thought of how she used to find beauty in broken things. He dropped the coins into the old woman's hand. She closed her fingers around them instantly, her eyes never leaving his face. He hefted the trunk, its surprising weight a solid thing against his chest. As he turned to leave, the woman spoke for the first time. Her voice was like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "Your wife would have wanted you to have it." Wallace froze, his blood turning to ice. He had never seen this woman before in his life. He was certain of it. Yet she spoke his wife's name. Not as a question, but as a statement of fact. That knowledge, that impossible connection, crawled over his skin like a nest of spiders. He stood there, rooted to the spot, holding the trunk that suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. His mind was screaming, trying to make sense of it. But the old woman had already turned away, fussing with her cracked plates as if their conversation was over. He wanted to shout, to demand answers. How did she know? Who was she? But the rigid set of her shoulders told him she would say no more. And a primal instinct screaming up his spine told him to get out of there, to leave before he found out something he wasn't prepared to know. The ride home was a blur. The trunk sat heavy on his lap, a box of secrets he wasn't sure he wanted to open. He replayed the woman's words over and over. She knew his wife. But how? His wife had never mentioned anyone like her. Her life had been an open book, or so he'd thought. Clementine was hanging laundry when he got back, clothespins clenched in her teeth. She saw the trunk and her hands froze. He carried it inside without a word and set it on the floor. The scrape of metal on the wood planks was unnaturally loud in the quiet house. Clementine followed him in, her gaze flicking between him and the trunk. "I bought it in town," he said, the words feeling thin and inadequate. "Why?" she asked, her voice soft. He didn't have an answer that made any sense. "It just reminded me of something." She nodded slowly, accepting his non-answer the way she accepted everything these days. But he saw the flicker of worry in her eyes. The fear that her father, broken by grief and debt, was starting to lose his mind, spending their last pennies on junk. He waited until she was outside with the chickens. Then he knelt before the trunk. With trembling hands, he lifted the lid. The hinges groaned in protest. The smell of dust and old paper billowed out. His fingers brushed against something soft. A dress, the fabric so old it felt like it might disintegrate into dust. Beneath it were the documents, stacks of them, tied with brittle cord. He lifted the first one into the fading light and carefully untied the knot. Legal papers, marked with official seals, covered in dense script. He recognized the format. It was just like his own deed to the ranch, but the names made his heart stop. His wife's family name, printed in neat, careful letters, and next to it, Edmund Hargrove, the man who owned the bank, The railroad, the whole damn territory. The man Wallace had only ever seen from a distance, riding in a polished carriage flanked by armed guards. Then he saw the date. His breath caught in his throat. He checked it again, his mind refusing to process the numbers. Signed, sealed, and witnessed. 3 days before his wife was born. He tore through the rest of the papers, his hands moving with a frantic energy. Letters, contracts, maps of property lines he'd never seen. Every single document was another thread connecting his wife's impoverished family to a fortune in land. A fortune they had never seen a penny of. She had told him her family had nothing. She had told him they were migrant laborers. She had told him she had no inheritance, nothing to her name but the clothes on her back. That was the truth he had married. The truth he had built a life on. These papers screamed that it was all a lie. The last document in the stack was a transfer deed. It moved all the property from his wife's family to Edmund Hargrove. The signature at the bottom, his wife's mother's name, was a shaky, almost illegible scrawl. It looked like the mark of someone who could barely hold a pen, let alone read the document they were signing. And beside it, in small, neat letters that were clearly written by a different hand, was a note. In full settlement of all outstanding debts, with all claims relinquished in perpetuity. His blood ran cold. The handwriting didn't match the signature. It didn't match anything else on the page. It was an addition, a forgery. Someone else had written those words. Someone had guided a terrified woman's hand to sign away her family's future. This wasn't a transaction. It was a theft, dressed up in legal ink. Wallace didn't sleep. He sat at the table all night, a single candle burning low, reading every word until his eyes burned. The language was dense, but the story it told was brutally simple. His wife's family had owned a kingdom. And in one swift, suspicious transaction, it had all been handed over to Edmund Hargrove, the same man who now owned the bank that was about to take Wallace's home. The irony was so bitter, it felt like poison. When dawn finally came, he carefully put the documents back in the trunk. He couldn't let Clementine see them. Not yet. He watched her go about her morning chores, her movements efficient and graceful. And a terrible question lodged itself in his heart. Had his wife known? Had she carried this secret, this colossal injustice, their entire marriage? Was her silence a way to protect him? Or had she been a victim of the lie, just like him? He told Clementine he had to go back to town. She assumed it was about the bank. He didn't correct her. He couldn't find the words to explain the truth. She just looked at him, her gaze steady and deep, and said, "Be careful." There was an understanding in her eyes that unnerved him. It was like she already knew they were in trouble far deeper than debt. He rode straight to the Territorial Records office. It was a small, dusty building at the edge of town, but it held the official history of every acre for 100 miles. The clerk was a thin man with ink-stained fingers who looked like he'd been born behind that counter. He squinted at Wallace. "I need to see the records for the Hargrove properties," Wallace said. The clerk's demeanor soured instantly. "Why?" "Family history," Wallace lied. The clerk grunted, not believing him for a second, but slammed a heavy ledger down on the counter. "Records are public," he muttered. "But looking at them and using them, those are two different things." It was a clear warning. Wallace ignored it. The ledger confirmed everything. 20 years ago, Edmund Hargrove had acquired 3,000 acres from a family with his wife's maiden name. The transfer was noted as payment for debts, but there was no record of the debts themselves. No invoices, no contracts, just a single damning line and a signature that looked more like a scratch than a name. "Were there any disputes filed?" Wallace asked. "None," the clerk said without looking up. "Any other transactions involving that family?" The clerk sighed, annoyed, but flipped through the pages. His finger traced the columns of cramped handwriting. Then it stopped. He tapped the page. Here. 6 months after the land transfer, a second transaction. A small house at the edge of town was sold to a woman with his wife's mother's name. The price was listed as $50. $50. For a lifetime of security. For a kingdom of land. It wasn't a sale. It was a pittance. It was hush money. The clerk slammed the ledger shut. You should be careful what graves you go digging up, mister. Some people around here believe in letting the dead rest. Are you one of them? Wallace asked, his voice low. The clerk looked him dead in the eye. I'm a man who likes his job, and his health. He turned his back, the conversation officially over. Wallace walked out into the blinding sunlight, his mind reeling. The documents were real, the theft was real, and the town was complicit, bound by a conspiracy of silence and fear. He could get on his horse, ride home, burn the papers, and pretend he'd never found them. He could protect Clementine from the storm that was coming. But then he pictured his wife's face, the way she worked her fingers to the bone on their small, failing ranch. Never complaining, always pushing forward. It was like she was trying to earn back something that had been stolen from her. Like she was paying a debt that wasn't hers. He didn't even make it to his horse before they found him. A man in a long, dark coat stepped out from an alleyway. He moved with the unhurried grace of a predator. His boots were polished, his hat was expensive, and his eyes were flat and cold. He stopped a few feet from Wallace, a smile on his face that held no warmth at all. Wallace Boone, the man said. It wasn't a question. My name is Garrett Kane. I'm an associate of Mr. Hargrove's. I hear you've been asking questions. I'm researching my family history, Wallace repeated, his hand instinctively moving closer to the old pistol at his belt. Kane's smile widened, showing a flash of teeth. Family history can be a messy business. Stories get tangled. The truth gets buried. Sometimes, it's better to let it stay buried, especially when digging it up might hurt the people you love. The threat was unmistakable, hanging in the air between them. Is that what this is? Wallace asked, his voice tight. A threat? Just friendly advice, Kane said smoothly. You have a daughter, Mr. Boone. A ranch on the brink. Debts you can't pay. It would be a real shame if your curiosity made a bad situation even worse. Kane took a small step back, and the movement was just casual enough to seem unintentional. But it wasn't. He adjusted his coat, and for a split second, Wallace saw the butt of a polished revolver tucked into his belt. I hope we have an understanding, Kane said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Wallace said nothing. He just stared, his jaw clenched so tight he felt like his teeth would crack. Kane nodded, taking his silence as agreement, and then he was gone, melting back into the shadows of the alley. The ride home was agonizing. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching hoofbeats. When he finally saw the ranch, Clementine was on the porch, waiting. She took one look at his face. What happened? He dismounted, his legs feeling unsteady. He told her everything, the documents, the land, the $50 payoff, the theft that had defined her mother's life before she was even born. He left out Kane's name, left out the direct threat against her. But she was too smart. She heard what he wasn't saying. What are you going to do? She asked, her voice quiet but firm. I don't know, he admitted, the words tasting like ash. Will fighting this, will it put us in danger? He wanted to lie. He wanted to tell her everything would be fine. But he looked into her eyes, so much like her mother's, and he couldn't. It might. She was silent for a long time, her knuckles white where she gripped the porch railing. Then she looked at him, and the fear in her eyes had been replaced by a cold fire. My mother worked herself into an early grave on this land because someone stole what was hers, what was ours. If there's even a small chance to make that right, We have to take it. I don't care if it's dangerous, because staying silent, that's the same as saying what they did was okay." He saw his wife staring back at him through his daughter's eyes. That same unshakable will, that same fierce sense of justice. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." And just like that, the decision was made. He wouldn't let it go. He wouldn't let them win. But he needed more than dusty papers. He needed a human voice. He needed someone who remembered the truth and was brave enough to speak it. That evening, he rode back to town. He went to the spot under the awning, but the old woman was gone. The space was empty, swept clean. He asked at the general store. The shopkeeper just shrugged, said she came and went like the wind. No one knew her name, where she lived, or where she'd gone. He asked if anyone else had bought from her. The shopkeeper laughed, said Wallace was the first person in months to buy any of her cursed junk. Wallace stood in the middle of the street as darkness fell. The old woman had known his wife. She had deliberately put that trunk in his hands. And now, just when he needed her most, she had vanished. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a move in a game he didn't understand. He thought of the documents, of Kane's threat, of Clementine's resolve. And he knew with a sickening certainty that the people who had buried this secret 20 years ago were watching him. They were watching, and they were deciding what to do about the man who had just dug it up. The next morning, Wallace began his search. He went to the oldest people in town, the ones whose memories stretched back decades. It was like hitting a wall of stone. They'd see him coming and suddenly have urgent business elsewhere. An old man literally crossed the street to avoid him. A woman slammed her door in his face. The fear in this town was a living thing, a poison in the water. Hargrove had them all terrified. By noon, he had one last chance. A retired ranch hand named Silas. The man was known to have a long memory and a loose tongue when he'd had a drink. Wallace found him mending a fence on the outskirts of town, his hands gnarled but steady. Silas didn't stop working as Wallace approached. "Heard you're asking questions that are making folks nervous." "I'm looking for the truth," Wallace said. Silas snorted. "Truth's a luxury in this territory." He hammered a post into the hard ground. Wallace pulled the documents from his saddlebag. "Is this the truth?" Silas finally stopped. He wiped his hands on his trousers and took the papers. He studied them for a long time, his face a stony mask. Then he started talking. He remembered the family, remembered their prime land, the best water source for miles. He remembered how Edmund Hargrove had wanted that land, needed it to connect his two largest properties, and gain total control of the water. The family had refused to sell. Then, one winter, the father died. A wagon accident on a steep road. No one questioned it. But Silas said, his voice low, "Accidents have a way of happening to people who stand in Hargrove's way." "Are you saying he was murdered?" Wallace asked, his stomach clenching. Silas handed the papers back. "I'm saying what I remember. You can draw your own damn conclusions." After the father's death, things got worse. The family, now just a widow and her young daughter, couldn't work the land. Hargrove offered to help with their debts in exchange for the deed. They refused. Then the real trouble started. Fences cut in the night, cattle scattered, a barn mysteriously burning to the ground. Finally, Hargrove sent his men. "Sign the papers," they'd told the widow, "or the next thing to burn will be your house, with you and your daughter inside it." "The signature," Wallace said, pointing to the shaky scrawl on the deed. "The woman could barely write her own name," Silas said, spitting on the ground. One of Hargrove's men held her hand, forced her to make the mark. Then another one filled in the legal garbage afterwards. It wasn't a sale. It was an execution. Why didn't anyone do anything? Wallace demanded. Silas looked at him with pity. Because anyone who might have spoken up suddenly had their own problems. Loans called in, contracts canceled, more accidents. Hargrove taught this town a lesson a long time ago. You don't cross him, not ever. Will you testify? Wallace pleaded. Will you tell a judge what you just told me? Silas just shook his head slowly. Testify to who? The judge is on Hargrove's payroll. The sheriff takes his orders. There's no law here but what Edmund Hargrove says it is. He picked up his hammer and turned back to his fence, leaving Wallace standing there with the proof of a crime that the world had already decided to forget. That afternoon, Wallace rode to the edge of Hargrove's property. The house was a mansion, a palace of stone and glass sitting on a hill overlooking the thousands of acres that should have belonged to his wife. It was a monument built on theft and, he now realized, murder. He stared at it, the anger in him a cold, hard knot. He thought of his wife, of Clementine, of the promise he had made. He had no allies, no witnesses, no law on his side, but he had the documents, and he had something else, something far more dangerous. He had absolutely nothing left to lose. As the sun began to bleed across the sky, Wallace turned his horse and rode back toward town. He wasn't going to run. He wasn't going to hide. He was going to burn it all down. He didn't go home. He rode straight to the biggest saloon in town, the place where Hargrove's men drank. He strode through the swinging doors, the dusty documents clutched in his hand. The room went silent. Every eye turned to him. He walked to the center of the room, slammed the papers down on an empty poker table, and his voice boomed in the quiet. I have proof, he announced, that Edmund Hargrove is a thief and a murderer. He laid it all out, the stolen land, the forced signature, the fraudulent transfer. The proof is right here, he said, his voice ringing with conviction. Anyone who wants to see the truth, come and look. For a long moment, nobody moved. The air was thick with tension. Then, a man in the back spoke up. That's a dangerous accusation, Boone. You'd better be damn sure. I am, Wallace said. Proof on paper don't mean nothing without a court to hear it, another man called out. And you ain't gonna find one of those in this territory. You're gonna get yourself killed. Some things are worth dying for, Wallace shot back. The man just shook his head, drained his glass, and walked out. He was the first. Others followed, their eyes refusing to meet Wallace's. Within minutes, the saloon was empty, save for the bartender who was suddenly very busy polishing glasses. They had abandoned him. Every single one of them. The fear of Hargrove was stronger than any sense of justice. He gathered the documents, the weight of his failure pressing down on him. As he stepped outside into the cool night air, he heard the scrape of boots on the boardwalk behind him. He didn't have to turn to know who it was. Garrett Kane stood there, flanked by 3 other men. They weren't ranch hands. They were gunmen, their hands hovering near their pistols. You were warned, Boone, Kane said, his voice dangerously soft. You were given friendly advice. You chose to ignore it. So now, the conversation gets less friendly. Wallace's heart hammered against his ribs, but he stood his ground. I'm not stopping. That's a shame, Kane sighed. Men who don't learn from words have to learn from pain. One of Kane's men lunged for the documents. Wallace reacted instantly, shoving the man back so hard he stumbled. The gunman's face contorted with rage, his hand dropping to his gun. Not here, Kane snapped, stopping him with a raised hand. Too many windows, too many eyes, even in this gutless town. He locked his gaze on Wallace. We'll finish this somewhere more private. Wallace didn't wait for a second invitation. He vaulted onto his horse and spurred it into a gallop, dirt flying from its hooves. He heard them mount up behind him, their pursuit deliberate and unhurried. They weren't trying to catch him. Not yet. They were herding him, letting him feel the terror of the hunt. He couldn't lead them to the ranch. He couldn't lead them to Clementine. He veered off the main road, heading for the rough, broken country to the west, a maze of canyons and ravines he knew better than anyone. They followed, their dark shapes relentless against the moonlit landscape. After a mile, Kane's voice cut through the night. "Stop, Boone!" Wallace kept riding. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way." "There's no easy way you get these documents," Wallace yelled back over his shoulder. "I don't want the documents anymore," Kane called out, his voice carrying an eerie calm. "I want you to disappear. Take your daughter, leave the territory, and never come back. That's the offer." Wallace reined his horse to a skidding halt, turning to face them. The four horsemen were silhouettes against the stars. "And what does Hargrove offer in return for my silence?" Kane's reply was chilling. "He's offering to let you live." Wallace looked at the four men, at their hands resting on their guns. He thought of the documents in his saddlebag, the proof of an unspeakable crime. He thought of Clementine, waiting for him, trusting him. He wondered if she could ever forgive him for the choice he was about to make. "I'm not leaving," he said, his voice steady. Kane's expression hardened in the moonlight. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." "I've made worse," Wallace lied. Kane simply turned his horse. "You have until sunrise," he called back. "Reconsider. If you're still here when the sun comes up, the offer is gone. And so are you." He watched them ride away into the darkness, and only then did his hands start to shake. He had just refused his only way out. Now, there were no more offers, no more warnings. Now, there was only the fight. A fight he had no idea how to win. He rode toward the ranch under the cold light of the moon, his mind a whirlwind of dead-end scenarios. Fight and die, run and live with the shame, surrender and betray his wife's memory. They weren't choices, they were just different ways to lose. When he reached the ranch, a light was on. Clementine was on the porch, a rifle laid across her lap. She had heard them. She had been ready. He slumped down on the steps, the fight draining out of him. He told her everything. The saloon, the chase, the ultimatum, sunrise. "Are we leaving?" she asked, her voice betraying no fear. "I don't know what else to do," he admitted, his voice raw. "It's over, Clem. We have no one. We can't fight them." She set the rifle aside. "Running means they win," she said, her expression so much like her mother's it was like a knife in his heart. "It means we spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders, knowing we let them get away with it. Sometimes the right choice isn't the safe one, Daddy." He wanted to argue, to tell her she was just a child, that she didn't understand. But he knew she was right. Her courage shamed his own fear into silence. They sat there on the porch, the minutes ticking away toward a deadly dawn, when they heard footsteps on the road. Wallace snatched up the rifle, his body instantly tense, shielding Clementine. A lone figure emerged from the darkness, their hands raised in a gesture of peace. It was the old woman, Abigail Cartwright. She walked into the faint light from the porch lantern, her face etched with worry. "I heard you made some powerful people angry," she said, her voice like gravel. "How do you know?" Wallace demanded. "Fear travels faster than horses in this town," she said. She glanced at the saddlebag where he'd stashed the documents. "You still have them?" He nodded. "Good," she said. "There's something I should have told you the day I sold you that trunk." Abigail told them her story. She had worked for his wife's family all those years ago. She had been a housemaid. She had seen it all: Hargrove's threats, the accident that killed the father. She had been in the room when they forced the mother to sign the deed, her hand guided by a gunman while another stood watch over her terrified child. His wife. She had stayed silent for 20 years. "Speaking up meant a shallow grave," she said, her voice cracking. "And I wasn't brave enough to die." But I'm old now. Death is coming for me one way or another. It makes a person brave. Why did you give me the trunk? Wallace asked. Because I knew who you were, she said. I'd seen your wife in town years ago. I saw her working this ranch, saw the exhaustion in her eyes. I always wondered if she knew. When she died, I decided her daughter deserved the truth. I kept those papers hidden, waiting for the right moment. When I saw you in town, a man with nothing left to lose, I knew the moment had come. Will you testify? He asked, a flicker of hope igniting in his chest. I'll do better than that, Abigail said, a grim smile touching her lips. I kept my own records. Names of the men Hargrove paid, dates of their meetings, details of the bribes to the judge and the sheriff. I wrote it all down, and I'll give it all to you. She leaned forward, her eyes burning with a righteous fire. We're not going to a courtroom, Mr. Boone. We're going to a trial by public opinion. We're going to force the people of this town to look at what they've allowed to happen, to choose a side. She told him the plan. At first light, they would meet in the middle of Main Street. Bring the documents, she said. And bring your courage, because when the sun comes up, we're either going to save this town or we're going to be destroyed by it. There's no in-between. As the first rays of dawn painted the sky, Wallace and Clementine rode into a town already buzzing with nervous energy. Word had spread. Something was happening. Abigail was waiting for them, standing alone in the middle of the street next to a wooden crate. Wallace dismounted, the documents under his arm, Clementine right beside him. Her presence was a silent, powerful statement. We are not afraid. Abigail threw open the crate. It was filled with ledgers and stacks of paper. She raised her voice, and it carried with surprising strength across the square. Edmund Hargrove is a thief, she cried, and I have the proof. The crowd grew, people emerging from their homes and shops, their faces a mixture of fear and fascination. Wallace held up the original deeds. He told the story of the theft, of the $50 payment, of the woman, his wife, who had been robbed of her birthright. His voice was steady, empowered by the truth. Then Hargrove arrived. He pushed through the crowd with Kane and a dozen armed men at his back, his face a mask of cold fury. Lies, he roared. Slander from a desperate man and a senile old woman. Documents can be forged, Mr. Hargrove, Wallace countered. But what about a witness? Abigail stepped forward, and she started naming names. The men who had set the fire, the man who had forced the signature, the sheriff who had taken a bribe to look the other way. Two of the men she named were standing right there in the crowd. Their faces went ashen. Kane, get these people off my street, Hargrove ordered. Kane moved forward, but then he stopped. Because the crowd had shifted. They weren't just watching anymore. They were murmuring. A man shouted, I remember that family. They were good people. Another voice called out, My father was forced off his land the same way. The dam of fear that had held this town hostage for 20 years was beginning to crack. Hargrove felt the power slipping from his grasp. He turned to the sheriff. Arrest them! But the sheriff, seeing the angry faces in the crowd, did not move. I think I need to see those documents, Mr. Hargrove, he said, his voice shaking slightly. And hear all the testimony. It was over. Hargrove's power had relied on secrets and fear, and in the bright light of day, with the truth laid bare for all to see, it crumbled into dust. Within days, a federal judge from outside the territory arrived. He reviewed the evidence, listened to Abigail's meticulous testimony, and heard from a dozen other townspeople who finally found their courage. The land transfer was declared fraudulent. The property was returned to its rightful heir, Clementine. Hargrove was ruined, his empire built on lies collapsing under the weight of his crimes. Wallace and Clementine stood on the hill overlooking the thousands of acres that were now theirs. The ranch was saved. Their future was secure. They had done more than reclaim the land. They had reclaimed their family's honor. He looked at his daughter, and he saw not a child, but a woman with the strength and conviction of her mother. He had bought a rusted trunk for 25 cents, and inside, he had found justice. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss another video. And if you have a story about a time when courage triumphed over fear, share it in the comments below. Thank you for watching.